This is No Hate Radio.
I'm no stranger to the rain. Oh, no. I'm no stranger to the rain.
Thank you for joining us on No Hate Radio. We are broadcasting this particular session of No Hate Radio on August 6th, 2024. My reason for emphasizing the dates at this point, and with respect to the political landscape series that we are doing, has to do with an old political axiom which has proven so many times to be true, that in politics 2 weeks is a lifetime. And what happens is things change. They change dramatically, and they change virtually overnight. So the political landscape in America has taken on a dramatic change within the last 30 days for sure, and has taken on changes internally. And since that time, we now have, in terms of the major political parties in America, we now have complete tickets, in that the Republican ticket has been confirmed, and of course the Republican convention has been held, and that side of the coin is established. With respect to the Democrat side, the other major political party, of course there was upheaval in terms of the incumbent electing to bow out, pass the torch, as it was called, to the next generation. Now we have a vice presidential candidate on that side of the coin. Most people don't really take note of the fact that it's not purely a binary choice, although as a practical matter in America it is, because of the two-party system. But we have other candidates. There will be independent candidates. There will be a Green Party candidate. There will be a Libertarian candidate. But the meaningful fact is, the truth is, that elections are a binary choice, particularly elections involving major political parties in statewide or nationwide races. So that's established at this point. That binary choice is now known. It's known to all of us. The subject matter that I was undertaking, or have been undertaking here on No Hate Radio as a monologue, because we haven't had speakers on this issue at this time. I still hope to do that, but as we lay out the political landscape in America, the last time that we had a session, we talked about Project 2025, the actual document that has been prepared at the behest of, and primarily sponsored by, and authored by, and published by the Heritage Foundation, which is a very, very conservative organization in America, based in Washington, D.C., with a lot of very conservative political leaders and academics and others constituting the membership. And they've prepared this Project 2025, which is called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, but is mostly known as Project 2025. And we talked about at the last session how that is structured, how that's written. But I think it's important now to go back over the fact that this is not the first manifesto of this type drafted by or on behest, at the behest of the Heritage Foundation. Actually, the first one was presented, published, and it appears from history fairly adopted by the Reagan administration, when the then, as they self-described themselves, the fledgling Heritage Foundation wrote its first conservative government manifesto and handed it to the Reagan administration. And it included things which are still remembered today, like the theory of trickle-down economics, which is largely, I think, been demonstrated as not being a truthful reflection of the facts, but it was nonetheless a basis of the economic policy and the economic plan that was tendered to, and as I said, it appears very much adopted by the Reagan administration. So the one that's out now, Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation now being some 40 plus years old, and garnering the support of other organizations also of the same political philosophy. This new Project 2025 is offered, it's published, and it is presented and requested, I guess I would say, argued that it will be the roadmap for an elected official in the executive office. In fact, it is directly stated in Project 2025 that it should be a guideline for the next conservative president elected in the United States. So in any event, Project 2025 is certainly, as regards its authors and its contributors, is supposed to be the roadmap for a conservative administration if elected. So we talked last time about the people who did generate it, where it comes from, what their political philosophies are, how you need to go look, go find, go see who the folks are and what they believe, and you have to go beyond Project 2025 and you have to go look at their websites and things that they put out, like the Alabama Policy Institute or the American Conservative or the America First Legal Foundation and all the others that are credited in Project 2025, one of which is called Freedom Works, Foundation for Government Accountability. Also, Hillsdale College and the Honest Elections Project. So as you can tell, most of these organizations have a bent toward a very, very conservative viewpoint or philosophy. So how would they have this new conservative president that they want to see elected, how would they have that adopted? And in what ways would they have that adopted? One, as laid out literally in Section 1 of the Project 2025, is how the executive office of the president and the White House office and the central personnel agencies would all be recast, restructured, and reorganized in such a way as to concentrate power in the executive office of the president. Along with that, this presumes, Project 2025 presumes, that you have also obtained a significant majority on the U.S. Supreme Court of people who have been literally philosophically vetted in the appointment process and have actually guaranteed in their testimony before the Senate that they would rule a certain way on certain cases, which in history before these current times was considered to be a completely improper question to ask a judicial officer, but now it seems to be the litmus test. So taking the reins of government, they call it, in Project 2025, involves concentrating the power in the executive and making certain that the executive office has exercised that power to be sure that the U.S. Supreme Court shares that political philosophy, at least a majority of the court, and that the executive office will have the authority and the power to move personnel around, take personnel in and out, and will generally limit any kind of checks and balances that are built into our Constitution, but Project 2025 abandons many of those things. The Section 2 is called the Common Defense, and interestingly enough, it purports to address in subsections: the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, State, the intelligence community, media agencies, and the Agency for International Development. A whole series of agencies, but primarily focused around the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department, as well as the intelligence community. And the notion here would be that these have been operated as independent, or at least quasi-independent agencies, so that they can rely on their own expertise. They are appointed to do a particular job. They are not daily accountable to the executive in that they have a charter. They have a thing to operate by. They have statutory construction. They have something that is a hard and fast rule. The Project 2025 would vest a lot of, I'm going to use the term ad hoc oversight of these agencies, to the extent that it doesn't just eliminate the agency altogether, which is what is suggested in the case of some agencies, or to harm those agencies to the point that they're not functional. In other words, neutralize those agencies to the point that they can't possibly have any effect. They can't actually do anything that the executive in the office in the White House doesn't want them to do. So this is certainly a different approach to government than we have seen over the last 200 years in America. They purport to address in Section 3 the general welfare, and they talk about everything from the Agriculture Department, Education, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection. Generally, Project 2025 would have most of these agencies either eliminated entirely, disbanded, or they would become ineffective and neutered in terms of being able to actually enforce anything. Part of the project has been already put in place by a recent case called the Chevron case in the U.S. Supreme Court, where the long-standing procedure that's based in a case, a Supreme Court case that resulted in a thing called the Chevron doctrine, is that the Congress would pass broadly worded legislation with an ultimate purpose. Agencies would then be charged with promulgating regulations that would effectuate that legislation, and that the courts would give deference to those agencies and their interpretations unless they found that they were inconsistent with the statute. If you abandon the Chevron doctrine, which has been done, in fact, the opinion by the justice who wrote it, Justice Gorsuch, was we are placing a tombstone on the Chevron doctrine. The effect of that is that these agencies, like the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, and more specifically, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Interior, and others, would no longer be able to count on receiving deference from the courts, or upon promulgating their regulations in furtherance of the broadly worded statutes passed by Congress. They would, in fact, in the future, based on the adoption or the abandonment of the Chevron doctrine, the courts would not give deference to any administrative agency interpretation of its own regulations, and would allow those matters to be reevaluated by the courts. And also it would drive the Congress to write legislation much, much more specific in its applications. And in that process, it would eliminate most of the ability that we have now to rely on the expertise and the background and the training and the knowledge that is vested in these administrative agencies and the people that are appointed and work there. So it's a pretty dramatic change in philosophy. The other thing that's a serious change, I think, in philosophy is having to do with education. Project 2025 only talks in terms of monitoring or changing the structure or eliminating power or dramatically reducing the power of federal agencies, because that's the way it's supposed to be structured, and that's what they're directing this new conservative administration to do. But the philosophy that underlies it, which I invite anyone to go look at the list of supporting and contributing authors to the Project 2025, is that there is to be essentially an assault on higher education, and there is to be essentially a total control over K through 12 education, primarily in the category of book banning, and other methods by which teachers and administrators would be constrained. They would be mandated to conduct certain curriculum and to eliminate concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion from their not only curriculum but the entire operation of the K through 12 system. Higher education, at least one of the four candidates currently in 2024 has said that it is time for an all-out attack on our universities. So that's consistent with the advocated policies that would be placed in effect if Project 2025 were used as the guideline by the new conservative administration. There is much discussion of the Department of Justice. Now, in Project 2025, and I mentioned this in my last comments on it, I think it discounts its possible value to anyone in that it spends a great deal of time denigrating and insulting the individuals like Merrick Garland, or anything that is done by the quote Biden administration is bad and anything done by the Trump administration is good. And that sort of thing is just filler. It's nothing more than political puff piece. So if you take Project 2025, you have to reduce its validity, I think, and particularly its scholarly or academic validity, if you're going to accept that as your political philosophy in general, in that it spends a lot of time engaging as a political puff piece and to denigrate people deemed to be on, quote, the other side. That's particularly true with the Department of Justice, so that the Department of Justice would be, and this is another point that I think bears a lot of consideration. Under the Project 2025, changes in the Justice Department would erode, if not eliminate, the distinction between the executive branch and the judicial branch, the Department of Justice, by allowing executive oversight through the absence of statutory mandates and through the watering down of the power of the Justice Department, and decentralizing the Justice Department down to individual United States attorneys and their offices across America. If you look at that in its narrative, just as, okay, we're going to decentralize the Justice Department and let all these U.S. attorneys have more power and influence, one might reasonably ask, well, okay, what's the downside of that? One is that a current administration appoints the U.S. attorneys, and the theory behind Project 2025 is that the very conservative individuals would control the Senate and would allow the approval or advice and consent. They would allow the nomination to be approved for all these United States attorneys only if they, like the Supreme Court justices and federal judges that are submitted to this advice and consent function, they would see to it that these people answered all the questions in the way that the very conservative movement would have them answer the questions. Department of Labor is an interesting function because the Project 2025, what we saw in the Reagan administration was a precursor to Project 2025, and it had to do with, it was played out in this way. Most people today don't remember it. Some weren't born when it happened, but the air traffic controllers in America entered into a strike. They were striking for better hours and better pay and a lot of other things. And President Reagan, I think if you look at this roadmap that was given to his administration, was following the plan, as it were. He simply fired every air traffic controller in America and replaced them with persons who were not a part of the controllers union or who were not organized in any way. The theory there is to neuter or do away with or limit the effectiveness of labor unions. This 2025 would suggest the National Labor Relations Act be substantially modified. The National Labor Relations Board would generally have no real authority to do anything. And things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I think in accordance with 2025, would simply be eliminated. There are multiple more things. One would be the Department of Commerce under Section 4, the economy, and the Department of the Treasury, Export-Import Bank, Federal Reserve, Small Business Administration. All those matters that would be addressed from this conservative administration that the Heritage Foundation and colleagues want to see elected and want to see adopt this plan. They would have the economy be regulated by not much. In other words, that the economy would gravitate toward an unfettered, unrestricted, almost Machiavellian kind of capitalism with no guardrails. That would be the ultimate result of the full implementation of Section 4 on the economy. And most of the federal legislation that tries to establish those guardrails would be either severely limited or the agency disorganized or fundamentally taken out in some cases. Because the notion that underlies Project 2025 is that America, as seen through the eyes of the authors and contributors to Project 2025, is a white male-dominated, fundamentalist Christian, pure capitalist society with no protections or guardrails for the vulnerable, and certainly no advantages of any kind or no benefits assigned on the basis of gender or sex or being a minority status and so forth. This would be eliminated if Project 2025 became that roadmap and went into full implementation. I think what you have to do is you have to not only study Project 2025, but then you have to study the websites and other information about the contributing authors to exactly understand what the end game of Project 2025 is. Independent regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, these agencies would again not be deferred to by Congress or by the courts, and their power and authority would substantially be reduced. They address the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Election Commission on the following basis. if Project 2025 is fully implemented by a conservative administration in the way that the authors want it to be, it will be very, very, very difficult to register and maintain registration to vote and to get to a polling place, because the notion that goes with it is that the underlying proposition, the idea, seems to be that elections are dishonest, that elections do not accurately reflect the totals of the voters who voted. And if you believe that, then if that is your personal philosophy, then you would support the notion that you have to have very stringent identity requirements, registration limitations. You have to have multiple ballot security people involved. You have to have a lot of pretty extreme controls on these federal elections, which is contrary, actually, to the philosophy that the most of Project 2025 wants to have implemented, which is very little government and mostly ineffective government, except that is administered by the executive and supported by the same philosophy Supreme Court and Congress. So Federal Communications Commission is addressed because of social media, because of things that are being published on the web, and because of efforts by the giants in the social media industry to regulate some of the incredible amounts of misinformation and disinformation that's placed on the platforms, the social media platforms. Of course, Project 2025 believes that, and they espouse the belief, the authors do, that is unfair to the, quote, conservative voice, that the conservative voice is stifled. So, again, one goal of 2025 would be to eliminate any ability by the social media platforms and mega companies to restrict any content on the web, which would include clear misinformation and disinformation. You have to go beyond Project 2025 in its content to understand, in many cases, what the underlying goal or the end game is in connection with the purported changes in all these federal agencies. Now, the rest of the story is this. It's done in the name of states' rights, that these many things ought to be relegated to the states. And now what is actually being touted is that the abortion question should be simply a state question, although certain members of the group, the authors and contributors of Project 2025, do favor in their literature and in their websites and on their documents a national abortion ban. It seems that the political standard bearers are not necessarily going there. So it's difficult to ascertain, I think, how much of Project 2025 would be adopted and carried through and made a part of the government's operating procedure that the authors and publishers and contributors of Project 2025 would want. I'm certain that there would be points of disagreement on the conservative side about which ones of these things to assign priority to and how far to go. But the fundamental concerns that I would like to raise here on No Hate Radio is that in trying to be a responsible citizen and trying to be someone who votes on a knowledgeable basis, someone who tries to understand what is the right way to go, as you would want to call it, or what is what's consistent with our heritage and our background and the kind of country that we claim to be. And I would encourage people to think about several things. Project 2025 and its authors and publishers, if you accept all their philosophies as part of the end game and the belief system that would be implemented into Project 2025, they would really, really make fuzzy the line between church and state. Remember, in this country, it's always been our goal that there would be a separation between church and state, and it was partly in deference, or not in deference, in objection to the Church of England and the fact that our founding persons had come from England, where there was an established church, and these people objected to that. So now what we would have through the limitation on public school curriculums, through the banning of certain books, through the elimination of academic freedom, through the assault on the universities and higher education, through a multiple part of the Project 2025, we would be very much blurring the line between church and state. The return to Machiavellian or unfettered, unrestricted capitalism as an economic model with no guardrails brings us back to the beginning of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, where people who had the power, money, and influence were abusing those who did not, very simply. And the best examples I can think of just right off the top of my head is child labor, company stores, black lung disease, unsafe conditions, long working hours, and other factors that seem to be associated with unrestricted, unfettered, almost Machiavellian capitalism. So you have to consider, if you no longer have an independent judiciary, because the judiciary has been vetted in the Senate confirmation process in such a way that we know the answer that judges would rule in a given case. If you no longer have independent federal agencies, they are either eliminated, neutered in effect, or under the direct ongoing supervision of the executive branch. If we have then violated another one of our fundamental doctrines in America for separation of powers. And we lose that in the full implementation of Project 2025. So after having read 922 pages of this material, but not just that, having then gone back to the websites of the listed contributors to see what is it they believe, what do they want to see done, because they're the ones who contributed to Project 2025. And having given it a lot of considerable thought, I offer this proposition that the full implementation of Project 2025 through a very conservative executive, backed by a very conservative Congress, backed by a vetted and pledged Supreme Court, will benefit, out of 330 million Americans, will benefit about 33 million of them. Now, does that ring another number in your mind? It certainly does in mine. And I'm not trying to bolster any particular individual, but in a campaign in 2016, Senator Bernie Sanders, who was running for the Democratic nomination of president, kept talking about the 1%. the 1%. Well, I don't think that Project 2025 would be limited to 1%. But I certainly believe that benefits under Project 2025, the net benefit would be certainly limited to about 10% of Americans, and about another 10% would see a neutral effect. It wouldn't change anything in their world. I offer this proposition on behalf of No Hate Radio, not to endorse or denigrate or promote anybody, but to encourage the listener of No Hate Radio to think about this. And I encourage you, although it's difficult to get through, read parts of Project 2025. Read and consider, and then go look at those websites for the supporters and authors, and then decide if you would believe that full implementation of Project 2025, whether you would be in the 10% that's benefited, the 10% that really isn't affected, or the 80% of Americans that would be harmed by the full implementation of Project 2025. So don't ever abandon our underlying mantra here. Why? And what are we going to do about it? Why is this? There is an underlying deep division in America right now about what America should look like, what America should be. Should it be a very strict and structured and essentially nostalgically idealized society? Or should we honor diversity, equity, and inclusion? Should we stick with the principles of separation of church and state, separation of powers? Should we stick with the notion that unfettered, unrestricted capitalism has more evils than good for most people and has to be subject to guardrails? What you need to do, if you're listening to this and thinking, where am I going to go? What do I think? What am I going to say to my friends? How am I going to vote? How am I going to approach this very complicated, extremely divided America? I think it's worthy to think about these concepts that I've laid out here today and say, which side? Because, folks, you can't be neutral. You either believe that Project 2025 and the conservative administration and the implementation of the ideas of the authors and developers of Project 2025 is the right kind of America, or you have to believe that there is a different kind of America that still honors and maintains the structure of the U.S. Constitution and the guidelines and the amendments or the limitations on pure capitalism, or use the term guardrails that are structured into the federal government. It's an important thought process to go through, and I strongly encourage you to go through it. Do your own research, do your own thought process, reach your own conclusions. I offer the conclusions of me as No Hate Radio. You should come up with your own ideas. We're going to move forward from Project 2025 now, and in our next sessions, hopefully we will, as soon as possible, go back to having our our guest speakers and talking about the political issues as they develop between now and the next 90 days. As we hear from the respective candidates what vision of America they have. And I think we need to listen. We need to listen very, very carefully. With all that today, thank you for listening to No Hate Radio. We really appreciate it. If there are matters you would like to see us undergo or undertake, if there are subjects you would like to see us be investigating or looking into, or even just observing, if you would like to be a speaker on No Hate Radio, just remember, nohateradio.com. It'll get you there. Just Google or whatever your search engine is and find No Hate Radio. On it, there is an input that you can direct an email to Cam, to our producer. There is also a phone number you can call. It's a recorded line, 442-4-NO-HATE, 442-4-NO-HATE. We would encourage your input, your ideas, and your thoughts, as we always do. And then the final point, what are we going to do about it? Well, what we're going to do about it, come November, we're going to make a national decision about which way America needs to go. And everyone that's eligible to vote is a part of that decision come this November. And between now and then, we plan to talk about some issues that involve the race itself. Again, we don't denigrate people. We don't talk about individuals, but we're going to talk about that. Again, let us know what you'd like to hear, and appreciate you staying with us throughout this whole broadcast. This is No Hate Radio.